و فاطمہ مغموم پر درود پڑھو، حسن حسین سے مظلوم پر درود پڑھو، تمام ائمہ مرحوم پر درود پڑھو، محب و چاردہ معصوم پر درود پڑھو، اللہم صلی علی محمد وآل محمد۔ درود پڑھنے سے چہرے پہ نور کا ہو ظہور، درود پڑھنے سے سب دل کی ہو سیاہی دور، درود پڑھنے سے ہر ایک قلب ہو پر نور، درود پڑھنے سے ملتی ہے باغ خلد میں حور، محب و چاردہ معصوم پر درود پڑھو، اللہم صلی علی محمد وآل محمد۔ درود پڑھنے سے ایمان و دین ہو کامل، درود پڑھنے سے حق پاس دور ہو باطل، درود پڑھنے سے جاہل بھی ہو تو ہو عاقل، درود پڑھنے سے اسلام ہوتا ہے حاصل، محب و چاردہ معصوم پر درود پڑھو، اللہم صلی علی محمد وآل محمد۔ درود پڑھنے سے ہو باغ انجمن خوشبو، درود پڑھنے سے ہو مثل گل دہن خوشبو، درود پڑھنے سے ہو سارا تن بدن خوشبو، درود پڑھنے سے ہو قبر میں کفن خوشبو، محب و چاردہ معصوم پر درود پڑھو، اللہم صلی علی محمد وآل محمد۔ یہی درود ہے مومن کا مصحف ایمان، یہی درود ہے زیب تلاوت قرآن، اسی درود سے ہے زینت نماز و اذان، اسی درود کا لازم وظیفہ ہے ہر آن، محب و چاردہ معصوم پر درود پڑھو، اللہم صلی علی محمد وآل محمد۔ درود پڑھ کے پکارا قلم ارکان، امین روک لو اب توسن زباں کی لگام، رسول فاطمہ زہرا ہے اور 12 امام، یہی بزرگ ہے سب لائق درود و سلام، محب و چاردہ معصوم پر درود پڑھو، اللہم صلی علی محمد وآل محمد۔
زینب کا تھا یہ نوحہ، بھائی ہے بھوکا پیاسا، اے شمر دور تہر جا، بھائی ہے بھوکا پیاسا، زینب کا تھا یہ نوحہ، بھائی ہے بھوکا پیاسا، اے شمر تو ٹھہر جا، بھائی ہے بھوکا پیاسا، सूखे गले पे खंजर मत फेर से सितमगर सूखे गले पे खंजर मत फेर सितमगर पानी पिलाड़ थोड़ा पाई है भूखा प्यासा शिम्र तू तहर्षा पाई है भूखा प्यासा सीने से तू उतर जा जख्मों में दर्द होगा सीने से तू उतर जा जख्मों में दर्द होगा मजलूम पर तरस खा भाई है भूखा प्यासा ऐ शिम्र तू तहरा भाई है भूखा प्यासा खोया है नौजवान को गाड़ा है बेज़बां को खोया है नौजवान को गाड़ा है बेज़बां को कोई नहीं है उसका भाई है भूखा प्यासा ऐ शिम्र तू तहर जा भाई है भूखा प्यासा चादर को छीन ले तू खैमों को लूट ले तू चादर को छीन ले तू खैमों को लूट ले तू उसकी नहीं है परवाह भाई है भूखा प्यासा है शिम्र तू तहर भाई है भूखा प्यासा अर्ज़ो समा के वाली देना है तू गवाही अर्ज़ो समा के वाली देना है तू गवाही पहलू में बैठ दरिया भाई है भूखा प्यासा ऐ शिम्र तू तहर जा भाई है भूखा प्यासा या फातिमा बाओ या मुर्तज़ा बाओ या फातिमा बाओ या मुर्तज़ा बाओ दम तोड़ता है बेटा भाई है भूखा प्यासा है शिम्र तू तहरा भाई है भूखा प्यासा ज़ैनब का था ये नौहा भाई है भूखा प्यासा ऐ शिम्र तू तहरा भाई है भूखा प्यासा
محمد وآل محمد صلوات کربل کی کہانی جب کوئی بھی سنائے گا، کربل کی کہانی جب کوئی بھی سنائے گا، دل والوں کی آنکھوں سے ایک دریا بہائے گا، وہ قافلہ سرور کا جو شان سے نکلا تھا، صغرا کو خبر کیا تھی، نہ لوٹ کے آئے گا، زہرا زہرا پرسال و 72 کا، زہرا زہرا پرسال و 72 کا، اور ٹوٹی ہے کمر شہ کی، گھبرانا مگر اکبر، فرزند نبی تیری میت کو اٹھائے گا، زہرا زہرا اکبر کا بھی پرسالو، زہرا زہرا پرسال و 72 کا، اور تھا ہاتھوں کے کٹنے کا کچھ غم نہ دلاور کو، تھا ہاتھوں کے کٹنے کا کچھ غم نہ دلاور کو، سیدانیوں کا پردہ اب کون بچائے گا، زہرا زہرا عباس کا پرسالو، زہرا زہرا پرسال و 72 کا، وہ پامال ہوا قاسم جب گھوڑوں کی ٹاپوں سے، پامال ہوا قاسم جب گھوڑوں کی ٹاپوں سے، کس طرح چچا تیری میت کو اٹھائے گا، زہرا زہرا قاسم کا بھی پرسالو، زہرا زہرا پرسال و 72 کا، اور سوتے ہی نہ تھے اصغر جھولے میں تڑپتے تھے سوتے ہی نہ تھے سرور جھولے میں تڑپتے تھے مادر کو خبر کیا تھی ایک تیر سلائے گا زہرا زہرا اصغر کا بھی پرسالو زہرا زہرا پرسالو 72 کا سرور نے اٹھائے تھے سب ساتھیوں کے لاشیں سرور نے اٹھائے تھے سب ساتھیوں کے لاشیں شبیر تیرا لاشا اب کون اٹھائے گا زہرا زہرا شبیر کا پرسالو زہرا زہرا پرسالو 72 کا محمد وآل محمد صلوات بر حبیب خدا ختم الانبیاء صلوات
Before we begin, if I could request everyone to move closer towards the minbar. Those who are on that wall, closer towards the minbar. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Secondly, tonight is the night of Shab Ashura. There are still 2 lectures after this night. But I wanted to take this opportunity to not think, but to say that the reward of those who participated in putting these programs together, the reward is with Janab Zahra. Especially these children who were over here, who all of them have been well behaved throughout these past 10 nights, listening to the lectures intently, for each of their deceased family members, as well as the deceased family members of those who put together these programs. Rahimallahu man qara al-Fatiha. And for those in the media room, there is some static coming from the mic, so inshallah, if we're able to clear that before the program begins, and that way, inshallah, things will go much smoother. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين أعدم الله أجورنا وأجوركم بمصابنا بمولانا أبي عبد الله الحسين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله والصلاة والسلام على إمام القبلتين ونبي الحرمين وأفضل الثقلين وجد الحسن والحسين الذي سمي في السماء بأحمد وفي الأرض بأبي القاسم محمد. وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين الصادقين والذين ذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين. أما بعد، فقد قال الله في كتابه الكريم: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إن إبراهيم كان أمة قانتا لله حنيفا ولم يك من المشركين. صدق الله العلي العظيم. For the love of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam, sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. For the love of the master of the martyrs, Imam al-Hussein, Sayyid al-Shuhada, a second salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. For the love of the one whom in Ziyaratun Nahiya says that every morning, every evening, I cry tears of blood for my grandfather Hussein, a louder salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. As the day of Ashura went on, a point had come that none of the companions of Sayyid al-Shuhada remained, and none of the family member of the Imam they remained. Neither was Qasim there, nor Aba Fadl Abbas, nor Aliyun al-Akbar. It reached to such an extent that even the 6-month infant of Sayyid al-Shuhada was martyred. You see, each of those companions, they sacrificed themselves in the hopes that Hussein would live. But then that point it came when the Imam was alone, and that moment which each of the companions or the members of the Ahlul Bayt didn't want to see. That moment it came where one Hussein stands an army of 30,000 upon the other side. As Imam al-Hussein goes and he faces that army, an individual by the name of Abdullah ibn Ammar ibn Yahud, he says that I would watch Hussein fight upon the day of Ashura. And as I saw this man who stood alone going up against an army of 30,000, he says, never have I seen an individual who has lost his friends and his family as steadfast and as in a state of composure as I saw Hussein. You see, the Quran, when it described the Prophet Ibrahim, it said, Inna Ibrahim kana ummatan qanitan lillahi hanifa. When the Quran it described the Prophet Abraham, it said that Ibrahim was an entire ummah. He was an entire nation. That even though Ibrahim was just one person, God says, "O Abraham, you are an entire nation amongst yourself. You know, the Mufassirin, when they discussed, they said, why is Ibrahim considered an entire ummah? They said from the first level, the first possibility is that all of the qualities and characteristics a society needs to be successful, all of them gather within the presence of Ibrahim. That generosity was in Ibrahim. That fearlessness was in Ibrahim. That Nimrud throws Ibrahim into the fire. Jibreel comes to Ibrahim and he says that, "Oh Ibrahim, that can I offer you help?" Ibrahim says that I only want help from the one who is able to help me. All of these different realities, generosity, fearlessness, being upon the path of God, all of them gathered within the personality of Nabi Ibrahim. So you find that the Quran on one level calls Ibrahim an ummah. Another reason why Ibrahim was called a nation is that in that time period when everyone was worshipping idols, there was only one individual who held on to the true deen of Allah and to the path of Tawheed and monotheism. And because Ibrahim was that sole individual upon that path, Allah says that Ibrahim is an ummah. No, another reason that Ibrahim was called an ummah and a nation is because the leader of a society is the reflection of that nation. That the verse of the Quran says that day will come that nad'u kulla unasin bi imamihim, that every society, when they come upon the day of judgment, from now or whether it was 1400 years ago, each of them, when they come, their imam and their leader will be in front of them. Because that imam, that leader which they take, is a reflection of their values. If their values are materialistic values or values of immorality, then they'll pick a leader, an individual who is immoral. So you find from amongst these different reasons, the Mufassirun discuss that why was Ibrahim considered a nation? But I say this line, that if Ibrahim was a nation by himself, then Hussein was all of human civilization gathered within one locus. That you see, if Ibrahim was an ummah for virtue gathered within Ibrahim, then Hussein is the one about whom we say, Assalamu alayka ya warita Adam safwatillah. Assalamu alayka ya warita Nuhin Nabi Allah. Assalamu alayka ya warita Musa Kalimullah. Assalamu alayka ya warita Ibrahim, ya warita Isa, ya warita Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. That Hussein, you are that individual, that the qualities of Adam, Nuh, Moses, Ibrahim, Isa, Rasulullah, they gather within you, O Hussein. So if Ibrahim was a nation for those virtues gathering in Ibrahim, then you find that reality is greater within the wujud of Sayyid al-Shuhada. You see, Ibrahim was that individual. Time after time, God tested Ibrahim. That Ibrahim waits for a child to be born. When that child is born, he says, go with your wife into that desert. Leave your child and your wife in that desert. Allah tests Ibrahim. In that time period, when it came to preaching Tawheed, they throw him in the fire. Allah tests Ibrahim. When that child grows up, Ismail, now Allah says, O Ibrahim, sacrifice your child. You know what the narration says? The narration says that when Ismail was being sacrificed, Ismail turned his face away from his father. He placed that cheek on the ground, which wasn't facing his father. And he said, O father, I know this is a moment of difficulty, but may no father see his son in this state. I say all of those tests of Ibrahim, and what was the test of Hussein at the body of Ali Akbar? You see, in reality, if all of those virtues are in Ibrahim, that he was an ummah for having a complete personality of virtue, and if he was an ummah for being one in a society that didn't remember the path of God, you find all of those realities, they gather within the wujud of Imam al-Hussein. And that's why when we remember Sayyid al-Shuhada, we remember him in a manner which is inconceivable. That when you look at the world today, from the east to the west, you find individuals have gathered to remember Imam al-Hussein. There were different tyrants, there were different dictators who suppressed the remembrance of Sayyid al-Shuhada. But you find one by one they fell, but the dhikr of the Imam, it remained. That wasn't it just a few years ago when Saddam used to be in Iraq. And Saddam used to limit the number of those who went for the ziyarah of Hussein. But after the fall of Saddam, you find numbers have been going to ziyarat, the likes of which have never been seen. Then Mutawakkil would come. That, you know, in the time period of Al-Mutawakkil, anyone who would go to the ziyarah of Sayyid al-Shuhada, they would cut the arm of that individual. A lady, she was going towards the ziyarah of the Imam. And as she's going, she reached the outskirts of Baghdad. When she reaches the outskirts of Baghdad, the man says, "Oh lady, don't you know we cut the right arm of everyone who goes towards the grave of Hussein?" That lady, she lifts her left arm. The man says, "Don't you know we cut the right arm?" She says, "I already gave my right arm in the way of Hussein last year." You see, this is that manner where Sayyid al-Shuhada is remembered. But as we approach the day of Ashura, a question which many individuals ask about that day is, how did the Imams of Ahlul Bayt remember the day of Ashura? That as soon as the moon of Muharram is sighted, whenever you go to Husayniyas and Imam Barghas and different centers across the world, you find that this discussion begins. That which of the customs within our remembrance of the day of Ashura are found within the hadith, and which of these customs are cultural manifestations. Or you'll find another group of individuals discuss that, does culture have a place within the remembrance of Sayyid al-Shuhada, or should we strictly be traditionalists who go upon the traditions of Ahlul Bayt? You see, to understand this discussion, we need to understand that, number one, what did the Imams of Ahlul Bayt say about the day of Ashura? And how did the Imams of Ahlul Bayt remember the day of Ashura? Because when you look at some of the traditions that are available, you'll find that there is a great amount of detail as to how one should mourn, but at the same time, you find that some traditions, they give principles. For example, one of those traditions which gives detail about how we should mourn is a famous dua of Imam Jaffar al-Sadiq salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi. Imam Jaffar al-Sadiq, in a tradition, when he makes a dua for the zawar and the visitors of Imam al-Hussein and those mourning over him, he says within that dua, فَارْحَمْ تِلْكَ الْوُجُوءَ الَّتِي غَيَّرَتْهَا الشَّمْسِ. That may Allah have mercy upon those faces, that when they went to the ziyarah of Hussein, the sun had changed their color. You see, when you go to the ziyarah of Imam al-Hussein, and these different effects of the journey come upon you, this is something which is passive. It's not something which you're actively doing. But what the Imam shows is that when you have made that niyyah for ziyarah, even that difficult you face upon that journey, even that is something which is gaining the rahmah and the mercy of Allah. Then after that, the Imam says, وَارْحَمْ تِلْكَ الْخُدُودَ الَّتِي تَتَقَلَّبُ عَلَى خُفْرَةِ أَبِي عَبْدِ اللَّهِ عَلَيْهِ السَّلَامِ. That may Allah have mercy upon those cheeks, that when they go to the grave of Hussein, they place and they turn their cheeks upon the grave of Hussein. Then after that the Imam says, وَرَحَمْ تِلْكَ الْأَعْيُنَ الَّتِي جَرَتْ دُمُوءُهَا رَحْمَةً لَنَا. That may Allah have mercy upon those eyes, that their tears, they fall out of mercy for us. وَرَحَمْ تِلْكَ الْقُلُوبَ الَّتِي جَزَأَتْ وَتَرَقَتْ لَنَا. That may Allah have mercy upon those hearts which are in a state of anguish and they burn for us. You see, each of these lines, they represent a different stage of mourning. That number one, there was a passive act of going and the effects of that journey. Then after that, you find the shedding of the tears or the placing of the cheeks on the grave of Sayyid al-Shuhada, or you find the burning of the heart. What the Imam emphasizes in this tradition is that each of these stages of the remembrance of the day of Ashura, although they are different, each of them has a value and each of them has a special mercy from Allah. The Imam could have said that line, "Oh Allah, have mercy upon the mourners," and ended the discussion. But the Imam says, have mercy upon the heart, have mercy upon the eyes, have mercy upon the face, have mercy upon those cheeks upon the grave of Hussein. You find the Imam repeating this line goes to show that each of these acts has their special own mercy when it comes to the remembrance of the day of Ashura. So you find that there are many traditions which describe how the Imams remembered the day of Ashura, but I'll divide this discussion into 4 parts. From the first part, we'll examine the mourning and the remembrance of the day of Ashura from the 61st year after Hijrah. In other words, the year of the day of Ashura, until the uprising of Mukhtar, which contains the period of the Imamat of Imam Zainul Abidin. From the second level, I'll examine how the Imams remembered the day of Ashura from the period of Imam Muhammad al-Baqir to Ghaibat al-Sughra. I'll number 3 examine the remembrance of Ashura, particularly up to the time of the 3 Shia dynasties, the Buwayhids, the Fatimids, and the Hamdanids. And number 4, I'll examine the remembrance of Ashura in the modern era. And based upon this, we'll come to an understanding that number 1, how did the Imams of Ahlul Bayt remember the day of Ashura? And in what manners does this remembrance of the day of Ashura go through a process of evolving and development? You see, from the very first level, when one examines the history and the historical records about the remembrance of the day of Ashura, in many ways, the mourning of this event began upon that day, or in many manners, it began even before that day. That when you look at Ibn Sa'd in his At-Tabaqatul Kubra, you find that he narrates a number of traditions about Rasulullah mourning over Sayyid al-Shuhada, and this is a source which all Shia and Sunnis, they accept this source. For example, one tradition states that as Rasulullah was ill, he says to his wife Salma that, "O Salma, don't allow anyone to enter my room, O Salma." As Salma was distracted, Sayyid al-Shuhada enters into the room of Rasulullah. He sits upon the chest of Rasulullah. And when he sits upon the chest of Rasulullah, Rasulullah begins to cry. As Rasulullah begins to cry, Salma, she comes, she begins to take Hussein. Rasulullah says, "O Salma, why are you taking my Hussein?" Salma says, "O Rasulullah, you said that no one should enter the room." But Rasulullah says, "O Salma, Hussein isn't just anyone." Salma says, "Then why are you crying, Rasulullah?" Rasulullah says, "O Salma, Jibreel came and told me that this Hussein will be massacred in Karbala." You know, there's another tradition. It's stated when Imam al-Hussein was within the womb of Fatima al-Zahra, Janab al-Zahra goes to Rasulullah And she says, "Oh Rasulullah, this child, he speaks to me." Rasulullah says, "Oh Zahra, what does he say to you?" Zahra says that he says to me, "Ya Umma anal gharib. Ya Umma anal madloom. Ya Umma anal waheed anal adshana." That Ya Rasulullah, he says that I'm alone. He says that I'm oppressed. He says that I'm thirsty. Rasulullah says, "O Fatima, this is Hussein, O Fatima. This is that Hussein of yours who will be killed upon the day of Ashura." So you find at one level, time and time again, Ahlul Bayt, even before the day of Ashura, would foretell of the martyrdom of Imam al-Hussein. That's why at the core of Azah, at the core of remembering the day of Ashura, is that emotional connection with Ahlul Bayt. There's some today who say that our majalis should be rational. They should be more academic. Yes, there is a place for academic discussion, but if you academically examine the traditions, you'll find at the core of all of these traditions is building an emotional connection with the family of the Prophet. Even Amir al-Mu'mineen on the way to the Siffin, as he's going there, the traditions, they say that Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib goes past the land of Karbala. And as Imam Ali goes past the land of Karbala, he says to his companions that over here their horses will be. And over here their camps will be settled. And over here their women will be taken captives. Then the Imam says, "Ha huna muhraku dima'ihi." And over here the blood of my son Hussein will be shed. You see, in many ways, the remembrance of the day of Ashura begins before the day of Ashura. But even after that day, the moment Sayyid al-Shuhada was killed, we begin to see that fundamental level of that emotional connection with Sayyid al-Shuhada. When Sayyida Zainab, on the 11th of Muharram, she goes past the body of the Imam, she looks at the cut body of her brother, and she says, "Anta akhi?" That, "Are you my brother Hussein?" Then she says, "Ya Rasulullah, hadal Hussein al-murammalu bid-dima." That, "Oh Rasulullah, this is Hussein who is covered in blood over here." So from this first period which I mentioned, the period which preceded Ashura, includes the day of Ashura until the uprising of Mukhtar and the Imamat of Imam Zainul Abidin, you find the first characteristic of the remembrance of the day of Ashura that we see is that emotional connection. The second characteristic that we see from the very onset of the event is the recitation of poetry. Abul Faraj al-Isfahani, in his famous work Maqatul al-Talibiyin, he writes that after the day of Ashura, Ummul Baneen would go towards Jannatul Baqi. And when Ummul Baneen would go to Jannatul Baqi, she would sit there and she would recite poetry for Imam al-Hussein and for her children. And in that manner, you find poetry was something which was at the core of the remembrance of the day of Ashura. You know, oftentimes when I go to different mosques across the world, I see that when the Marthia is being recited, or the Salam or the Sozkhani is being recited, you see that the mosque is empty at that moment. But the moment the lecture it begins, you find the mosque, it fills up. But in reality, when you look at the traditions, at the core and from the earliest time period, the poetry about the day of Ashura had a fundamental position to the extent that the Imams of Ahlul Bayt would sit on the ground and the poet would sit on the mimbar. And this is the reality of history. For example, when we look at some of this early poetry, one of the daughters of Aqil, the brother of Amir al-Mu'mineen by the name of Zainab, after the event of Ashura, she would recite the line of poetry, would say that Mada taquluna in qala an-nabiyyu lakum. That what will you say if the Prophet said to you, Mada fa'altum wa antum akhirul umami? That what have you done when you are the last of nations? Bi itrati wa bi ahli ba'da muftaqadi, with my family after I departed. Minhum usara wa minhum durriju biddami. That from my family there are those who are captured, and there are those who are covered within their blood. So you find that this is an early example of poetry. So from the earliest onset, at the core of Aza or Azadari, we see number one, an emotional connection with the family of the Prophet. Number two, we see the recitation of poetry. But the third thing that we see in this early time period after the day of Ashura, in the time period of Imam Zainul Abidin, is that Imam Zainul Abidin would seek to awaken the consciousness of that society. You see, one goal of this morning processions is that it awakens our consciousness, that it returns us back towards the path of God. You know, if you have an academic lecture and you send out invitations, you have it at the best of universities, you have the best of professors speaking, you find it won't draw a crowd in the way the Majlis of Hussein draws that crowd. That when the Majlis happens, you don't need to send an invitation. People, they begin to say that these are the days of Muharram. These are the days of gathering. They begin to come to these gatherings. But I say there is no bigger mass education system than the Aza of Sayyid al-Shuhada. Because the Aza of Sayyid al-Shuhada has that power which no other nights do. That many people say that outside of these 10 nights, you find the mosques that they are empty. But the reality is that it is Hussein who drags them within these nights. And Imam Zainul Abidin, through the remembrance of the Imam, the third feature of the remembrance of the day of Ashura that we see is that Imam Zainul Abidin would seek to awaken the consciousness of those in that time period. You know, the Imam, na'udhu billah, was not weak-hearted. That they place water, he begins to cry. They place food, he begins to cry. But rather, Imam Zainul Abidin wanted to inform of the reality of Ashura. That when an individual was cutting an animal, Imam Sajjad would say, did you give water to that animal? They'd say that we are Muslims, it's in our tradition to give water. Imam Sajjad would say, did you give food to that animal? They would say, we're Muslims, it's our tradition to give food. He would say that, did you sharpen the sword? The man would say, I sharpened the sword. And the Imam would say that when they killed my father, neither did they give him water, nor did they give him food, neither did they sharpen the sword when they killed my father. In a separate incident, a man comes to the land of Medina, and he was an individual who was a stranger within that land. And as he's there in front of Imam Zainul Abidin, he says, Ana al-gharib, I'm alone. The Imam says that, oh man, if you were to pass away, would they give a kafan to your body? Would they bury you? The man says, they would bury me. Imam Sajjad says that if anyone is gharib, then my father Hussein was gharib. So in this manner, in the first stage of Azah, what do we see? We see, number one, the presence of poetry. Number two, we see that emotional connection. And number three, we see the waking of a conscience. If you ever want a barometer, that is our azadari going in a direction away from Ahlul Bayt or is our aza in that direction, then we have to say that fundamentally, is that emotional connection there? Is the recitation of poetry there? Because if you lose that emotional connection and you lose that poetry, then you'll find that that core of aza, which we see in the first period, that core is being lost. But after the first period, then you find within the second period begins the time of Imam Muhammad al-Baqir towards Ghaybat al-Sughra. You see, in this second period, we begin to see the development of the day of Ashura as an identity, as a symbol of one's faith. In other words, we begin to see hadith about the virtues of mourning. Number two, we begin to see traditions about the ziyarah of Imam al-Hussein. Number three, we begin to see an etiquette about the day of Ashura. Imam Muhammad al-Baqir and Imam al-Sadiq, because of the freedom they were given in comparison to the other Imams, they would mention how one should act upon the day of Ashura. For example, Imam al-Baqir would say that anyone who begins to gain livelihood on that day, that wealth will have no barakah for them. That on that day, if you can avoid work on the day of Ashura. If you can avoid being frivolous and happy, avoid that on the day of Ashura. As I said, the minimum adab and etiquette we should have about the day of Ashura is that we act as if our father passed away. That is the minimum etiquette. But in reality, this is the one who was the father of this ummah, Hussein. So you find Imam al-Baqir gives an adab. So from the first level, in the second stage, we see the development of adab and etiquette. Another thing which we see in the hadith of Imam al-Baqir is that Imam al-Baqir would encourage gatherings where people would remember Ahlul Bayt within their homes. Some may say that this tradition of having majalis within our homes, is this mentioned within the hadith? Yes, it's mentioned within the hadith. There was an individual by the name of Saleh bin Uqba. He comes to Imam al-Baqir and he says to the Imam that, "Oh Imam, what is the reward of the one who visits your grandfather upon the day of Ashura?" The Imam says, anyone who visits my grandfather on the day of Ashura, their reward is 2,000 Hajj, 2,000 Umrah, and it's as if they fought 2,000 battles with Rasulullah. Then that man says, وَمَا لِمَنْ كَانَ مِنْ بُعْدِ الْبِلَادِ وَأَقَاسِيهَا. What about the person who is far from the land of Karbala? The Imam says, then that individual on the day of Ashura, he should go out near the time of Dhuhr into a terrace or an elevated place. He should send salam upon Sayyid al-Shuhada. He should send lan upon the killers of Sayyid al-Shuhada. He should recite 2 units of prayer. And then he should cry over the Masayib of Hussein. وَيَأْمُرُ مَنْ فِي دَارِهِ بِالْبُكَاءِ عَلَيْهِ. And he should command those who are in his house to cry over Sayyid al-Shuhada as well. That you find that the Imam says, what this individual should establish, وَيُقِيمُ مُصِيبَتُهُ بِإِظْهَارِ الْجَزَاءِ عَلَيْهِ. That individual should establish the mourning of Sayyid al-Shuhada within their homes as well. So within the early hadith, we see number one, an emotional connection. We see the recitation of poetry. We see that there are gatherings. We see, for example, that Imam Zainul Abidin would give food to the women of Banu Hashim who would gather and wear black. Many people, they ask that where does this system of tabarruk come from? This system of tabarruk comes from Imam Zainul Abidin. That Imam Zainul Abidin with his hands would go and give the women of Banu Hashim the food when they would gather to mourn Sayyid al-Shuhada. But as we go on from the time of Imam al-Baqir to the time of Imam al-Sadiq, we begin to see that the poetry about the remembrance of the day of Ashura, it begins to take a particular form. For example, Abu Harun al-Maqfuf comes to Imam al-Sadiq. And the Imam says to Abu Harun, Anshidni fil Hussein, recite poetry for my grandfather. Abu Harun begins to recite poetry. When Abu Harun is reciting poetry, the Imam says, oh Abu Harun, don't recite like this. Abu Harun says, then how should I recite? The Imam says, Anshidni kama tunshidun ya'ni birrikka. That when you recite poetry for my grandfather, recite it with a rikka and sorrow. If those who are sitting by the door can move closer towards the mimbar, there's many elders, many individuals who are still entering, and they'll continue to enter as the time of Maghrib approaches to make space for them. Closer towards the mimbar, Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So you find that a specific form begins to develop. In another tradition, the Imam says, Anshidni kama tartihi inda qabr al-Hussein. The Imam says, recite your marsiya in the way that you would recite at the grave of Sayyid al-Shuhada. Imam al-Hussein gave an adab to every Soz Khan, to every Noha Khan, to every Marsiya Khan, to every reciter of poetry, that the adab when you recite poetry for Imam al-Hussein is that you recite it as if you were standing by the grave of Sayyid al-Shuhada. After that, you find another poet by the name of Abu Umara. He would say that whenever I would recite poetry for Imam al-Sadiq, never would I see Imam al-Sadiq smile for the rest of the day. You see, up until the time of Imam al-Sadiq, this adab was developing. But in the time period of Imam al-Qadim and Imam al-Riza, you find that the period of mourning is extended towards 10 days. And Imam al-Rida would hold 10 majalis and gatherings for the remembrance of his grandfather. And a tradition says that whenever the moon of Muharram was sighted, the face of Imam al-Qadim would change until the day of Ashura. But you find that these traditions, what they show is that number one, that emotional connection, the recitation of poetry. We find that there is an adab and an etiquette. We find to have morning gatherings within your home. We find that there is tabarruk, but in the same way, you find azah and remembering of the day of Ashura is a living tradition. That's why when you examine history after the beginning of the major occultation, you find that azadari goes through development. The way they mourn in India is different than how they mourn in Iran or in Iraq or in Azerbaijan or in Turkey. There is a cultural manifestation. For example, when you look in the Buwayhid time period and the Fatimid time period, in the 10th and the 11th century, that is the first time we see the concept of a procession and a julus. Before Mu'izz ad-Dawla in the 10th and 11th century in Iraq, we did not have open processions. In the Fatimid era, we begin to see specific places to remember Imam al-Hussein, called Husseyniyas or Imam Barghas. You find that this occurs later. So you find the summary of the discussion is this. Azah is a living process. The remembrance of the day of Ashura goes through development. But at the core of that development is that emotional connection with Ahlul Bayt. And you find we've reached the peak of that emotion upon the day of Ashura. You know, how should one mourn for Imam al-Hussein? There was a poet by the name of As-Sayyid al-Himyari. When As-Sayyid al-Himyari comes to Imam al-Sadiq, you know, whenever any poet came to the Imam would say, Anshidni bayanan, recite more masayib. But when Sayyid al-Himyari came to Imam Sadiq, the Imam says, Sayyid al-Himyari, stop reciting Masaib. I can't handle any more of the musibah. What did Sayyid al-Himyari say that the Imam says, stop the musibah? You know, Sayyid al-Himyari, he writes, Umrur ala jadat al-Husayn faqul li'a'adumih az-zakiyya. That when you go to the grave of Hussein, say to the blessed body of Hussein, A'adu man la zilti watfa'a sakibatin raviya. That, you know, whenever you go to a grave, you put water on the grave, right? Sayyid al-Himyari says that, oh body of Hussein, we didn't bring water to put on your grave, but rather our tears will water your grave, O Hussein. وَإِذَا Don't leave the grave of Hussein. وَابْكِي كَمُعْذِلَةٍ أَتَتْ يَوْمًا لِوَاحِدِهَا الْمَنِيَّةِ. This is that